In the summer of 612 BC, the largest city on earth stopped existing. Not conquered, not occupied, turned into a ruin heap, in the words of the men who did it. And the people who burned it were paying back a debt. For 3 centuries, Assyria had done this to everyone else. That line comes from a clay tablet in the British Museum. It is the closest thing we have to a contemporary report, and it is written by the winners. This is the fall of Nineveh. Start about 8 years earlier, and look at the board. On paper, Assyria is still the greatest power on earth. This is the empire that had swallowed Babylon, broken the kingdom of Israel, taken tribute from Egypt, and marched an army to the gates of Jerusalem. The empire we followed at Karkar and again outside Jerusalem in the last 2 episodes. It runs from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, and no single state in the region can meet it in the field. But the map is changing quietly underneath it. In the south, Babylon has spent decades in revolt and now has a king who is not going to settle for independence. In the east, beyond the Zagros Mountains, the Medes are consolidating into something Assyria has never had to deal with before, not a raiding people, but a coalition with a king who can plan a campaign a year ahead. And Assyria itself has just come through a civil war over the succession. The empire now has serious enemies on 2 sides at once, and for the first time in 3 centuries, it does not have the strength to face both. The king in the south is Nabopolassar. He was probably a Chaldean officer in Assyrian service, a man the system trained, who then turned on it. He took Babylon's throne in 626 BC, and he spent the next decade doing something no rebel had managed before, not just surviving Assyria, but grinding it down. The Babylon of glazed lions and processional gates belongs to his son, but it is built on what Nabopolassar won. The king in the east is Cyaxares. The chronicle calls him Umakister. What the Medes actually were in 612 is genuinely hard to pin down. Most of what later writers say about them is Greek and late. Even this carving is Persian, cut about 1.5 centuries afterwards. We do not really have a picture of them. What we can say is what the tablet says, and when the decisive blows land, the Medes strike them. In 616, Nabopolassar goes north up the Euphrates, collecting tribute from the tribes along the river as he goes. Near a place called Gablini, he catches an Assyrian force and inflicts, this is the chronicle's own phrase, and it will use it again, a major defeat upon Assyria. Notice where he is fighting. This is not a rebel defending Babylon. This is a Babylonian army operating hundreds of miles north of home, on Assyria's own river system, choosing where the war happens. And then something genuinely revealing occurs. An Egyptian army marches up to help Assyria. Egypt had spent centuries as Assyria's victim, rival, and occasional tributary, and now Egypt would rather prop the old empire up than watch a new one take its place. The 2 of them chased Nabopolassar back down the river, and the chronicle notes, without a flicker of drama, that they did not overtake him. Then the war slides east, away from the Euphrates, into the hills around Arafah, modern Kirkuk. Nabopolassar beats the Assyrians there too and drives them back to the Zab. But this is not a collapse yet, and it is worth being honest about that, because the ending makes everything before it look inevitable. It was not. The very next year, Nabopolassar besieges the city of Aššur itself, and fails. The Assyrians counterattack and push him the whole way back to Tigris, where he holds out through a 10-day battle before they give up and withdraw. For years into the war, Assyria has lost ground, lost armies, and lost the initiative, but it is still standing, still fighting on 2 fronts, and still capable of chasing a Babylonian king 100 miles down a river. Then, at the end of that same year, the chronicle drops in one short sentence that changes the war. 7 words. The Medes have come down out of the mountains, and Assyria now has a second front. 614 BC, and the Medes come down out of the Zagros in force. Their first target is Tarbisu, a town the chronicle places in the district of Nineveh itself. That is only a few miles from the capital, and Assyrians standing on the walls of Nineveh could have seen the smoke. And then the Medes do something that tells you they are not raiding. They are running a campaign. They do not besiege Nineveh. They turn away from the greatest city in the world, march south down the Tigris, and go for a target that on any military map looks like the lesser prize. Aššur, the oldest capital, the first city of the empire, and the home of the god the empire and the people were both named after. Assyrian kings were crowned in its temple and buried in its ground. The Medes stormed the city and destroy it, and the chronicle records a terrible defeat inflicted on its people. Nabopolassar is coming up the river to join them, and he does not make it. He arrives after the city is already gone. The tablet does not editorialize about this, but it does keep the sequence very clear, and it is the kind of detail a Babylonian scribe had no reason to invent. The great Babylonian victory of 614 was won by somebody else, and his own king turned up late. It is hard to overstate what this meant. Burning Aššur was not a raid on a frontier town. It was the destruction of the religious center of the Assyrian world, the equivalent of losing not your capital, but your cathedral, your archive, and your founding myth in a single afternoon. And in the ruins of Aššur, the two kings meet and come to terms. Later Greek writers dressed this up with a royal marriage. The tablet just records the agreement. However it was sealed, this is the moment Assyria's death is arranged. Two enemies who could each be handled separately have stopped being separate. It is worth pausing on the source itself. Most ancient battles reach us through poets and propagandists writing generations later. This war we can follow almost year by year in a dated Babylonian chronicle, terse, administrative, and largely uninterested in glory. Documents like this one are how we know any of it. It will also, in a moment, refuse to tell us the one thing we most want to know. 613 goes quiet. Nabopolassar spends it campaigning down on the middle Euphrates, putting down a revolt, doing the ordinary work of holding a kingdom together. Assyria gets a year. Then comes 612, and the difference this time is visible on the map before a shot is fired. In every previous year, the Babylonians and the Medes had been two armies operating in the same region at different times against the same enemy. Now they combine. They meet in the south and they come up the Tigris as one force, past the burnt-out shell of Aššur, past Kalhu, following the river north through the heart of the Assyrian homeland, through the most heavily settled, most intensively farmed, most defended ground in the empire. And there is no field battle. That absence is the loudest thing in the record. Assyria had been the most successful war machine in the world for 300 years, and when a combined enemy army walked up the Tigris to its capital, nobody came out to stop it. The chronicle has one verb for what happens next, and it is worth keeping exactly as it is. They encamped against Nineveh. Not stormed, not assaulted. Encamped, sat down around the largest city on earth, and settled in to wait. And Nineveh was worth sitting down in front of. Sennacherib, the king who had walked away from Jerusalem 90 years earlier, had rebuilt it into something without rival. New streets, a palace he named the Palace Without Rival, gardens fed by aqueducts from the hills, and a library that is still teaching us how these people thought. This is one of those gardens, carved on the wall of his grandson's palace. The trees, the walkway, the water arriving on its arches. Around 100,000 people lived inside roughly 12 kilometers of wall. Population figures for ancient cities are always estimates, and this one is argued over. But on any of the numbers, Nineveh in 612 was the largest city on earth. The siege opens in the month of Samanu, roughly June. And then the chronicle does something that tells you exactly what kind of document it is. From the month Samanu until the month Abu, it says, for 3 months, they subjected the city to a heavy siege. That is the whole military account. 3 months of the most consequential siege in the ancient Near East, and the scribe gives it one sentence and moves on. No engines, no assaults, no numbers, no heroics. What he does give us is a calendar, start month, end month, duration, because he is writing an administrative record, not a story. And then, on a day of Abu whose number is broken off the edge of the tablet, they inflicted a major defeat upon a great people. So let us go down to the city itself, because the shape of it matters. Nineveh sits on the east bank of the Tigris. at the point where a small river called the Koser comes down out of the eastern hills and runs into it. The Koser cuts the city in half. Kiyunjik, the palace mound, to the north, Nebi Yunus, the arsenal mound, to the south. Both of them sit over on the western side, right against the river. Around the whole thing runs about 12 kilometers of wall, broad across the northern end and tapering as it goes south, enclosing something like 750 hectares. And by high summer of 612, sitting outside that wall on 3 sides, are the camps of 2 armies who have no intention of leaving. Then the walls fail, and this is where an honest map has to stop and admit what it does not know. We do not know which wall gave way. We do not know whether it was mined, breached, stormed, starved, or opened from the inside. The chronicle does not say, and nothing else contemporary does either. There is a much later tradition that the river rose and broke the defenses, and you will find it repeated confidently in a lot of places. It is a good story. It is not in the tablet, so it is not on this map. The king of Assyria dies in the fall of his own capital. 8 words, no scene, no last stand. Whatever actually happened to sin-shar-ishkun, the chronicle either did not know or did not consider it worth the clay. We know exactly what an Assyrian siege looked like, because Assyria carved its own sieges onto palace walls in obsessive detail. The ramps, the archers, and then this, the column of people walking out of a taken city with what they could carry. Those reliefs were how the empire advertised itself. In 612, the same techniques were used on the people who invented the advertisement. The archaeology agrees with the tablet. Excavators at Nineveh found the destruction level, burning, collapse, and human remains left where they fell near the defenses. The city was not just taken, it was emptied and left. The looting ran on into August, and then the Medes went home. That is worth sitting with for a second, because it is the part people skip. Cyaxares had just destroyed the greatest city on earth, and he took the loot and left. The Medes had come to break Assyria, not to inherit Mesopotamia. Having done the first, they had no interest in the second, which means the empire's territory, its provinces, its trade routes, and its ruins all fell to Nabopolassar by default. And what was left of the Assyrian court did not surrender at all. It went west, up the road toward Haran, where a man named Assurbanipal had himself proclaimed king of an empire that no longer possessed a capital, an army, or a god's city to be crowned in. Nineveh itself was never rebuilt. 200 years later, a Greek army marched straight past the mounds and recorded them as an abandoned city whose name nobody could remember. The largest city on earth had become a shape in the ground. Elsewhere, people who had lived under Assyria reacted the way you would expect. The prophet Nahum's poem about Nineveh is savage, jubilant, and entirely uninterested in balance. It is not a battle report, and it should not be read as one, but it is real evidence of something, which is how the news landed on the people the empire had spent 300 years terrifying. What ends here is bigger than a city. The Neo-Assyrian Empire had run the Near East for 3 centuries. The standing army, the deportations, the provincial system, the machine behind Karkar and behind the march on Jerusalem. In one summer, the machine stops. Assyria is not quite dead. A court at Haran will keep the name alive for a few more years, and Egypt will march north to help it, which does not end the way Egypt expects. But that is another story. Subscribe, and we will keep going in order.